in the sprawling metropolis of Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg, a young boy was born in 1952, utterly unaware that his name would one day resonate across the globe. He was a product of a nation still healing from the wounds of war, molded by a history that seemed to permeate the very air of the Soviet streets. The apartment buildings were cramped, the winters unforgiving, and the memories of hardship lingered close. This was the backdrop against which Vladimir Putin first entered the world. Before we get into the main content, please consider subscribing to my channel, giving a like, leaving a comment, and share and support me in bringing more great videos to you. Thank you so much. His early life mirrored that of many Soviet children. Families lived in close quarters in communal apartments, sharing kitchens and bathrooms with multiple households. Privacy was a luxury, and the walls were thin enough to carry the sounds of laughter, arguments, and the hushed hopes of neighbors. Life was simple, yet characterized by a quiet resolve. The city was painstakingly rebuilding itself from the devastation of World War II, and every corner bore witness to its enduring spirit. Putin's parents were both survivors of the war. His father had served in the Navy before joining the workforce at a factory. His mother had endured the harrowing siege of Leningrad and lived to witness the city's rebirth. Their lives were defined by sacrifice, austerity, and an unwavering instinct for survival, values they quietly instilled in their son, not through grand pronouncements, but through the daily grind of perseverance. Even as a young boy, Putin was small in stature, but possessed an intensity that set him apart. He was quick to defend himself when necessary, and even quicker to keenly observe the world around him. The Soviet Union was a vast and complex entity, steeped in authority, discipline, and ideology. However, it wasn't ideology that captivated the young boy. Rather, it was control, structure, and the enigmatic world of intelligence services that he sometimes overheard adults whispering about. He sought to understand how power operated, how decisions were made, and how nations could be shaped from behind the scenes. This curiosity drew him to sports. He dedicated himself to judo and sambo, martial arts that demanded not only physical strength, but also strategy, patience, and the ability to leverage an opponent's force to one's own advantage. Many who knew him during those formative years noted his quiet determination. He was not one for idle chatter, but when he committed himself to something, he pursued it with an unwavering intensity. These early experiences, learning discipline through rigorous physical training and cultivating patience through careful observation, would later shape his approach to leadership. By the time he reached adolescence, the Soviet Union was a nation rife with contradictions. It was powerful yet fragile, unified yet divided by ideology and bureaucracy. The Cold War cast a long shadow over everything, influencing school lessons, television programming, and even the imaginations of children. And it was within this environment that Putin's dream took shape. He didn't aspire to become a soldier or a politician. Instead, he dreamed of joining the KGB, the Soviet intelligence agency that he viewed with a mixture of admiration and fascination. The idea of serving the state through intelligence work felt to him like the ultimate calling, a path where one could protect a nation discreetly, without the need for applause or recognition. However, even this dream required patience. He couldn't simply join the KGB. He had to study, prepare, and understand the system from the inside out. And so, he set his sights on higher education as the first crucial step. Putin enrolled at Leningrad State University to study law. At first glance, law might seem like an ordinary path, but in the Soviet context, it was deeply intertwined with governance and statecraft. He delved into constitutional law, international law, and philosophy. The more he learned, the more intrigued he became with the very structure of the state, its intricate mechanisms, its inherent vulnerabilities, and its capacity to shape society. During these years, Putin matured not only academically but also emotionally. The university era was a time of transformation across the Soviet Union. It marked the beginning of a shift, subtle at first, but unmistakable to those who were paying close attention. The institutions remained, but their stability felt increasingly precarious. Political winds were shifting, and young minds sensed that the future might not be as set in stone as they had once believed. While studying, Putin forged connections with professors and friends who would later play significant roles in his political trajectory. He also encountered individuals working discreetly within government structures, offering him glimpses into the world he yearned to join. Eventually, after years of perseverance, he achieved his long-held ambition, acceptance into the KGB. It was a defining moment in his life. The KGB was far more than just a workplace. It was a world governed by unwavering loyalty, strict secrecy, and rigid discipline. It trained him to meticulously analyze information, to decipher motivations, and to anticipate actions before they unfolded. These lessons weren't mere theory. They were practical tools that would later shape his understanding of politics, security, and the delicate balance between nations. His initial assignments took him away from the vibrant energy of Leningrad and placed him into quieter roles: analysis, monitoring, and eventually foreign intelligence training. The years he spent in the KGB weren't filled with dramatic espionage, as some might imagine, but with careful observation, structured routines, and the patience required to understand systems from the inside out. He was mastering the art of influence, not through brute force, but through subtle manipulation. In the mid-1980s, Putin was assigned to East Germany, which was then still within the Soviet sphere of influence. Dresden, the city where he was stationed, became a window through which he witnessed the shifting realities of the Cold War. He observed the stark contrast between ideological promises and the practical struggles of everyday life. He saw how fragile systems could become when subjected to mounting pressure. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, he experienced firsthand the collapse of a world order he had known for his entire adult life. The fall of the wall was more than just a political event for Putin. It was a moment of profound reckoning. The Soviet Union itself was beginning to crumble. Institutions that had once seemed unshakable now appeared vulnerable. For him, the chaos of this transition became a pivotal point, prompting fundamental questions about stability, identity, and the future of the state. By the early 1990s, Putin returned to a Russia that had been utterly transformed. The Soviet Union had dissolved, the economy was in freefall, and the country was struggling to redefine itself. Putin, now a former intelligence officer navigating a new reality, found work within the city government of St. Petersburg. It was here, far from the grand political stage of Moscow, that he began to hone the skills of public administration. When Vladimir Putin stepped into the political world of post-Soviet Russia in the early 1990s, he entered a landscape that bore no resemblance to the disciplined, orderly system he had once known. The Soviet Union was gone, and the rules that had defined his youth had vanished almost overnight. In their place stood a Russia searching for an identity, chaotic, hopeful, wounded, and deeply uncertain. In St. Petersburg, where he initially served under Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, Putin worked quietly behind the scenes. His role wasn't glamorous. It involved licensing, foreign trade, and administrative coordination. However, these responsibilities gave him a first-hand glimpse of a city and a country undergoing a profound transformation. St. Petersburg in the 1990s was a city of stark contrasts. On one street, foreign investors were appearing for the first time, eager to explore opportunities in a newly open Russia. On another street, poverty deepened, crime surged, and remnants of the old Soviet era clung to daily life. Putin saw both sides of the coin, the promise and the fragility, and as he handled negotiations and worked with business partners, he developed a keen appreciation for how economic stability could influence political stability. Many people who worked with him during these years described him as calm, efficient, and unfailingly loyal. He didn't engage in unnecessary chatter. He observed more than he revealed. He had learned from the KGB the importance of understanding people before taking action, and he now applied these lessons in the world of government. However, political winds shifted quickly in the 1990s. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid, Putin found himself at a crossroads. With the Soviet Union gone and his position in city government dissolving, he faced a moment that could have ended his public career entirely. Instead, fate led him to Moscow. In 1996, Putin was invited to join the Presidential Property Management Directorate in Moscow, a bureaucratic role, but one located at the very heart of the federal system. For a man who had spent most of his life far from the center of national power, Moscow offered a new vantage point. The capital was bustling with reformers, businessmen, international advisors, and competing political factions, all vying to shape the future of post-Soviet Russia. Putin navigated this environment with careful precision. He didn't align himself with the loudest voices or the most flamboyant reformers. Instead, he worked quietly and reliably, earning a reputation as someone who could manage complex tasks without drawing undue attention. This style, low-profile competence, caught the eye of influential figures within the Russian government. By the late 1990s, Putin's rise accelerated rapidly. He was brought into the presidential administration and later appointed head of the Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor to the KGB. It was a symbolic return to his roots, but under entirely new circumstances. The FSB of the 1990s operated in a Russia filled with uncertainty, economic collapse, regional unrest, and a population struggling to adapt to free market realities. Putin's work in the FSB reinforced what had always guided him: order, stability, and a firm belief that strong institutions were essential to keep a country intact. He remained largely silent publicly, rarely granting interviews and rarely revealing emotion. His steady presence stood in stark contrast to the turbulent atmosphere of the era. Then came 1999, a year that would fundamentally change the trajectory of Russian politics. President Boris Yeltsin, whose leadership had guided Russia through its early post-Soviet years, was facing growing pressure. The country's economic crises, declining public trust, and pervasive political fatigue created a sense of deep uncertainty at the highest levels of government. In August of that year, Yeltsin appointed Putin as prime minister. It was a surprise to many Russians, who barely knew his name. To journalists, he seemed too reserved. To political rivals, too inexperienced. But to those who worked closely with him, he was someone who remained composed under pressure and possessed a deep understanding of the inner workings of the state. Only months later, on December 31st, 1999, Boris Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, transferring power to Putin as acting president. Russia entered the new millennium with a new leader, a man shaped by Soviet discipline, post-Soviet chaos, and a quiet calculation of intelligence work. In the early months of 2000, Putin traveled extensively across the country to meet with citizens, governors, and military officials. He understood that Russia was vast, geographically, culturally, and economically. Its regions ranged from resource-rich Siberia to struggling industrial towns. Some areas thrived, while others felt utterly abandoned. Putin listened, observed, and took careful notes. He saw a country fractured by the rapid transition from one system to another. His first priority became clear: to restore stability. For Putin, stability wasn't simply the absence of conflict. It was a creation of a predictable and functioning state. He believed that without strong central institutions, Russia risked further fragmentation. Many citizens, weary of the instability of the 1990s, understood and embraced this message. To them, Putin represented order after a decade of chaos. In 2000, he won the presidential election, solidifying his position. With this mandate, he began reinforcing state structures, tax systems, regional governance, energy control, and federal authority. He emphasized the importance of national unity and economic recovery. His speeches were measured, lacking the emotional flair of some leaders, but they resonated deeply with the population craving consistency. One of the central pillars of his early presidency was the energy sector. Russia's reserves of oil and natural gas were among the largest in the world. Putin recognized that controlling and modernizing this sector would give Russia significant leverage, not only economically but also geopolitically. Under his leadership, major energy companies were restructured, state influence increased, and Russia's position as a global energy supplier grew rapidly. At the same time, Putin focused on military reform. The Russian armed forces, weakened by the collapse of the Soviet Union, needed modernization. For him, military strength wasn't an act of aggression but a form of national security, an insurance policy for a country with vast borders and complex neighbors. During these years, Russia's international posture also began to shift. Putin emphasized that Russia would cooperate with the world but would not be sidelined. He sought dialogue with Europe and the United States, yet also positioned Russia as an independent force, not bound to Western-led frameworks. This dual approach, engagement paired with assertion, became a hallmark of his foreign policy style. In the early 2000s, as Vladimir Putin settled into his role as president, Russia entered a period of dramatic redefinition. The country, still recovering from the instability of the 1990s, now stood at a critical crossroads. Its institutions were fragile, its economy uneven, and its national identity uncertain. Putin, with a calm but focused demeanor, began to chart a path forward, one rooted in stability, centralized authority, and a revived sense of national confidence. The initial years of his presidency were characterized by concerted efforts to restore control. Regional governors, who had gained considerable autonomy during the post-Soviet decade, were brought back into a more unified federal structure. The Russian state, which had long been weakened by political fragmentation, began to regain its coherence. Putin's approach was steady and deliberate, rather than abrupt and radical. He understood that Russia's sheer size and complexity required a strong central hand, not for purpose of domination, but for effective coordination. Simultaneously, Russia's economy began to undergo a significant transformation. Rising global oil prices played a crucial role, fueling rapid growth in state revenues. For Putin, the energy sector was far more than just a source of income. It was a strategic asset, one that could support domestic development and elevate Russia's position on the global stage. Major companies, particularly in the oil and natural gas industries, became increasingly aligned with state interests. Gazprom and Rosneft grew into global giants, wielding influence in markets far beyond Russia's borders. Pipelines stretched across continents, linking Russian energy resources to European cities and industrial centers. With each new project, Russia strengthened both its economic ties and its political leverage. Energy policy became the cornerstone of Putin's strategic vision. Russia would serve as a stabilizing force in global energy supply, and in turn, gain significant influence in foreign policy. This approach wasn't inherently confrontational. Rather, it was functional, based on interdependence, contractual agreements, and long-term partnerships. However, to many nations, it served as a potent reminder that energy could shape geopolitics as profoundly as diplomacy or military alliances. Alongside these economic reforms, Putin focused on rebuilding Russia's military capacity. The armed forces of the 1990s had struggled with outdated equipment, low morale, and chronic underfunding. Under Putin's leadership, a comprehensive modernization program was initiated. Training was improved, new technologies were introduced, and military reforms aimed to restore structure, discipline, and confidence. These changes were gradual but significant. They reflected Putin's conviction that a large country with vast borders and complex neighbors needed a reliable defense, not for aggressive purposes, but to ensure its own security and stability. The early 2000s also saw Putin navigating Russia's place within the evolving international order. Initially, he expressed a willingness to cooperate with Western nations. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, Russia even provided support in counterterrorism efforts. However, as the decade progressed, tensions gradually reemerged. NATO expansion, debates over missile defense systems, and fundamental differences in regional interests created friction. Putin's speeches began to adopt a new tone, still measuring calm, but subtly firm. He insisted that Russia deserved respect as a sovereign state with its own distinct national interests. For many Russians, this tone struck a deep chord. After the disorientation and uncertainty of the 1990s, the idea of a strong, stable, and respected Russia resonated deeply on an emotional level. It wasn't solely about power. It was also about reclaiming national dignity and pride. During these years, Putin also consolidated his influence within domestic politics. The United Russia Party gained dominance in parliament, and the media environment shifted. While opposition voices continued to exist, the political landscape became increasingly consolidated under his leadership. Supporters viewed this as a necessary step to ensure stability. Critics, however, viewed it as a suppression of political competition. But regardless of the interpretation, the system increasingly reflected Putin's steady, controlled approach to governance. In 2004, Putin won re-election, reinforcing his position and confirming his widespread popular support. His second term saw the deepening of many of the policies he had initiated: economic modernization, energy expansion, and a renewed sense of military confidence. However, it also brought new challenges, most notably the ongoing conflict in Chechnya and broader concerns about terrorism. Chechnya, a region with a long history of unrest, was brought under tighter federal control, and reconstruction efforts were initiated. Although the conflicts have been violent and painful, the region gradually stabilized. Putin emphasized order and integration, hoping to prevent further fragmentation within Russia's diverse federation. As the 2000s progressed, Russia's global presence became increasingly pronounced. Energy partnerships with Europe expanded. Trade with Asia increased, and relations with China deepened through shared interests in energy, security, and economic development. Putin saw the rise of Asia not as a threat, but as an opportunity to diversify Russia's international partnerships. Yet, despite this expansion and cooperation, tensions with the West continue to simmer. Competing visions of global security, conflicting interpretations of sovereignty, and disagreements over regional conflicts created a widening gap. Putin watched these developments carefully, always with a keen eye toward maintaining Russia's autonomy and strategic independence. By 2008, Putin had reached the end of his second presidential term, the constitutional limit at the time. Instead of amending the system, he stepped into the role of prime minister while Dmitry Medvedev became president. For many outside of Russia, this arrangement seemed unusual and even perplexing. For Putin, it was a means of ensuring continuity and stability. During this period, he remained highly influential, coordinating government operations, guiding strategic decisions, and maintaining close cooperation with Medvedev. Some policies were softened, while others were intensified. Russia continued to modernize its infrastructure, expand its energy routes, and enhance its military readiness. In 2011, widespread protests emerged in Moscow and other cities, expressing dissatisfaction with various political and economic issues. Putin, accustomed to navigating complex and challenging environments, responded with a combination of firmness and controlled reform. The protests didn't destabilize the country, but they revealed underlying shifts within Russian society. Young people demanding greater transparency, new political voices emerging, and a population increasingly connected through digital networks. As 2012 approached, Putin prepared to return to the presidency. Russia was no longer the country he had inherited in 2000. It was more stable, more assertive, and more visible on the world stage. It had stronger institutions, a revitalized military, and an energy sector that extended its reach into global markets. Yet significant challenges remained: inequality, corruption, regional disparities, and the ongoing question of Russia's place in a rapidly changing world. When Vladimir Putin returned to presidency in 2012, both Russia and the world around it had undergone significant changes. The early 2000s have been a period of rebuilding and consolidation, but the decade that followed will be marked by rising tensions, shifting alliances, and major geopolitical events that reshaped the global order. Putin entered his new term with deeper experience, a sharpened awareness of Russia's vulnerabilities, and a clearer vision of the role he believed his country should play on the world stage. Russia in 2012 was no longer the uncertain and fragmented nation of the 1990s. It was more confident, more cohesive, and increasingly assertive in its international relations. Yet beneath the surface, pressures were building. Economic disparities between regions, generational divides, and deep-seated ideological rifts. Putin returned to office acutely aware that domestic unity was essential for navigating the turbulent years that lay ahead. One of the defining moments of this period arrived in 2014. The political crisis in Ukraine, followed by the change of government in Kiev, triggered a chain reaction across Eastern Europe. For Russia, Ukraine had long been deeply intertwined with its history, culture, and strategic interests. The seismic shifts happening next door prompted decisions that would fundamentally alter the global political landscape. In March 2014, Crimea, following a controversial referendum, was incorporated into Russia. The move drew widespread international condemnation, resulting in sanctions and a sharp deterioration in relations with Western countries. To supporters inside Russia, the event symbolized a restoration of historical ties and a surge of national pride. To critics abroad, it signaled a major rupture in the post-Cold War order. The episode marked a turning point. Russia and the West entered a period of deep mistrust, setting the stage for years of heightened geopolitical confrontation. Despite these tensions, Putin continued to pursue internal reforms and long-term strategic objectives. Infrastructure projects expanded across the country, modernizing roads, ports, and transportation networks. The energy sector remained central, not only as an economic pillar, but also as a vital diplomatic tool. Russia supplied oil and natural gas to many parts of Europe, creating a complex relationship built on mutual interdependence. Energy pipelines crossing borders became symbols of both cooperation and competition. At the same time, Russia's military underwent another wave of modernization. The conflicts of the 1990s and early 2000s had exposed certain weaknesses. Now, under Putin's direction, the military embraced technological upgrades, improved training, and enhanced mobility. These reforms were visibly demonstrated in Russia's intervention in Syria, beginning in 2015. The Syrian intervention was one of Putin's most consequential foreign policy decisions. At the request of the Syrian government, Russia deployed air support and strategic assistance. The operation aimed to stabilize the region, counter extremist groups, and maintain Russia's influence in the Middle East. It showcased Russia's growing military capabilities and signaled that Moscow was prepared to act decisively far beyond its borders when its strategic interests were at stake. International reactions were mixed. Some nations viewed the intervention as a forceful assertion of power. Others saw it as a decisive move in a complex and volatile conflict. But regardless of perspective, the world understood that Russia under Putin was no longer a passive observer in global affairs. Meanwhile, the domestic political landscape continued to evolve. Large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg became hubs of economic growth and cultural modernization. Yet concerns about inequality, regional development, and political freedoms remained sensitive topics. Younger generations, connected to the world through digital technology, held different aspirations and expectations than those who had lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin recognized that communication would play a crucial role in maintaining stability. His speeches during this period balanced pragmatism with a narrative of national resilience. He emphasized sovereignty, security, and the need for Russia to pursue an independent path, free from external influence. These messages resonated strongly with many Russians who felt that global dynamics were shifting in unfavorable and unpredictable ways. The mid-2010s also brought significant challenges in the economic sphere. International sanctions strained key industries, yet Russia adapted by redirecting trade flows, supporting domestic agriculture, and building closer ties with Asia, especially China. Economic cooperation between Moscow and Beijing expanded rapidly in areas such as energy, transportation, and technology. This shift marked a significant reorientation of Russia's global partnerships. As tensions with Western countries persisted, diplomacy became increasingly complex and layered. Conferences, negotiations, and international forums remained important, but the underlying mood was cautious. Nations assess one another not only through political dialogue, but also through military posture, cyber capabilities, and economic vulnerabilities. The world was entering a new era, less predictable, more fragmented, and Putin seemed acutely aware of this transition. By the late 2010s, Russia was once again a central player in global energy markets, military strategy, and diplomatic realignments. Its actions influenced discussions across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Analysts debated whether Putin's leadership represented a reassertion of national power or an adaptation to a shifting world order. Regardless of the interpretation, his decisions carried significant weight far beyond the borders of Moscow. In 2018, he was re-elected, continuing the path he had set years earlier. His new term came with fresh challenges: fluctuating global energy prices, rapid technological changes, territorial tensions in Eastern Europe, and the rise of new forms of international competition, not just military, but informational and economic. The late 2010s were marked by increasing global uncertainty. Trade disputes escalated, regional conflict intensified, and climate pressures reshaped political priorities. In the midst of these changes, Russia's diplomacy became a delicate balancing act, cooperating where possible, competing where necessary, and asserting its own interests whenever strategically advantageous. As 2020 approached, few could predict the disruptions that would soon affect the world. Yet even before the global pandemic, The geopolitical environment was tense and volatile. Russia's actions continue to draw scrutiny, admiration, criticism, and curiosity from different corners of the globe. Putin remained a central figure in discussions about security, energy, and the future of the international order. When the world entered 2020, few could anticipate. Here's the translated and rewritten content, adhering to the specified style. How rapidly global events would shift was something few could have predicted. For Vladimir Putin, whose leadership had already spanned 2 decades, the coming years were poised to become some of the most demanding and defining of his career. Russia was entering a new era, one characterized by profound uncertainty, sweeping transformation, and considerable global turbulence. Once again, Putin found himself navigating a complex web of challenges that extended far beyond Russia's national borders. The first major test arrived with striking speed. The global pandemic disrupted economies worldwide, severely restricted international travel, and placed immense strain on societies across continents. Russia, like every other nation, confronted the daunting task of managing public health risks while simultaneously striving to maintain economic stability. Putin addressed the nation on numerous occasions, emphasizing the importance of resilience and national unity in the face of this unprecedented crisis. Hospitals expanded their capacity, emergency measures were swiftly introduced, and teams of scientists dedicated themselves to adapting treatments and developing effective vaccines. Yet the pandemic proved to be more than just a health crisis. It fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Global supply chains experienced critical breakdowns. Energy markets fluctuated wildly, and nations worldwide began reassessing their strategic vulnerabilities. For an economy as heavily reliant on energy as Russia's, the shock was particularly significant. Oil prices, long considered the backbone of federal revenue, plummeted in unpredictable patterns. Russia, however, demonstrated its capacity to adapt, diversifying its exports, bolstering its financial reserves, and deepening economic ties with countries across Asia. By late 2020, the world was gradually adjusting to this new reality. However, tensions in Europe were once again on the rise. Political discourse in many countries grew increasingly sharp and divisive. Alliances found themselves strained, and long-standing disputes resurfaced with renewed intensity. Putin watched these developments with keen attention, fully aware that global instability often carried hidden and far-reaching consequences for Russia. In early 2021, the situation escalated into a major geopolitical crisis. The conflict in Ukraine intensified dramatically, drawing global attention and triggering widespread responses from governments around the world. For Russia, the stakes were exceptionally high. Historical connections, critical security concerns, and regional influence all converged in a complex and increasingly volatile environment. The conflict instantly altered global dynamics. Sanctions multiplied rapidly, significantly impacting banking, trade, aviation, and technology sectors. Countries re-examined their energy dependencies, and markets reacted sharply to every new development in the region. For Russia, these measures necessitated rapid adaptation and strategic reevaluation. The government swiftly redirected economic focus toward internal production, expanded partnerships with nations in Asia and the Middle East, and implemented policies designed to stabilize financial systems. Within Russia, the conflict became a defining moment, shaping public discourse and sparking diverse perspectives. Some citizens viewed it through the lens of national security and the protection of national interests, while others questioned the long-term costs and consequences. Amid this turbulent environment, Putin maintained a composed and unwavering tone, emphasizing national sovereignty, historical context, and the underlying geopolitical realities. Internationally, the conflict became one of the most intensely analyzed events of the decade. Nations chose sides, sometimes with caution, sometimes with assertive action. Diplomatic channels remained active, albeit strained. Conferences, negotiations, and mediations took place across multiple continents, each attempting to navigate a shifting landscape of alliances and strategic interests. Meanwhile, energy politics reached unprecedented levels of importance. As Europe reduced its reliance on Russian natural gas, Russia strategically expanded its export routes toward Asia. New pipelines and long-term agreements solidified its role in Eastern energy markets. For some nations, Russian oil and gas became indispensable amid global shortages. For others, energy diversification became a paramount national priority. In every direction, Putin's strategic decisions profoundly shaped the global energy map. Throughout the mid-2020s, Russia continued to modernize its military capabilities, not only in traditional forces, but also in cyber defense, aerospace technologies, and long-range systems. These developments reflected a growing belief that future conflicts may not be confined to open battlefields, but could also unfold in digital networks, strategic infrastructure, and remote domains. Domestic life in Russia also underwent significant evolution. Large cities continued their technological expansion, adopting digital services, smart infrastructure, and new industrial hubs. However, rural areas continue to face familiar challenges, including limited economic opportunities, demographic shifts, and infrastructure gaps. Putin's administration introduced programs aimed at fostering regional development, improving connectivity, and providing support for agriculture. Whether these measures would be sufficient remained a topic of constant debate and scrutiny. Amid these national efforts, the political environment remained complex and multifaceted. Younger generations grew increasingly vocal, influenced by global culture and digital interaction. Older generations remained strongly anchored to memories of past instability and valued the sense of structure and order that Putin had prioritized. These contrasting perspectives formed the backdrop of social dialogue, shaping Russia's evolving national identity. On the global stage, Putin maintained a strategic presence. Russia played key roles in Arctic policy, energy corridors, multilateral forums, and negotiations spanning Asia and the Middle East. Diplomatic discussions remained intense, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, but always reflective of Russia's enduring influence. By 2025, the world had entered a period of accelerated change. Technological competition intensified dramatically. Nations reevaluated their supply chains, security frameworks, and military alliances. Climate shifts created new pressures on resources and infrastructure. In this environment, Russia continued to assert itself as a major global power, skillfully navigating complex terrain between cooperation and rivalry. Putin, now a figure with decades of leadership experience, carried a sense of continuity into these years. Experience shaped his decisions. History shaped his instincts. In private moments, rare but meaningful, he may have reflected on the long arc of his life. From a modest apartment in Leningrad to the presidency of a vast nation facing the unprecedented complexities of the 21st century. For many around the world, Putin remained one of the most influential and often polarizing figures of the era. Analysts tirelessly debated his strategies, his motivations, and the long-term consequences of his policies. Supporters saw a staunch defender of national sovereignty. Critics saw a disruptive force challenging the established global order. Scholars attempted to interpret his leadership through various frameworks of history, geopolitics, and personal background. Yet beyond all interpretation, one fact remained undeniable. Russia under Putin played a decisive role in shaping the modern world. As Part 5 draws to its final notes, the story rests not on definitive conclusions, but on the enduring reality of continuity. Putin's influence, whether admired or challenged, remains deeply embedded in global debates concerning security, energy, and the future balance of power. Russia continues to move forward through a world defined by complexity, intense competition, and growing interdependence. History does not end neatly, and the leadership of any nation, especially one as vast and consequential as Russia, creates echoes that linger far beyond a single era. Putin's story, inextricably intertwined with the story of modern Russia, continues unfolding in real time. Part 5 ends with an open doorway, where the next chapter will be written not by prediction, but by the unfolding of history itself.